There's a castle in the Lungau Valley, perched on a rocky outcrop in the Austrian Alps, stone walls rising dark against the mountain sky, a medieval fortress where the screams never quite faded. Thousands visit every year. They come looking for ghosts, for the torture chambers, for the place where hundreds of women and children were broken on the rack, burned at the stake, executed for crimes they never committed. They come expecting dungeons with rusted instruments, interrogation rooms where confessions were extracted through agony, the workspace of witch hunters who believed they were doing God's work by destroying innocent lives. What they find is all of that, and worse. Because Moosham Castle's history isn't mysterious, isn't debated, isn't shrouded in legend that might or might not be true. The records exist. The court documents survive. The names of the victims are written down. The methods of torture are described in meticulous detail. The confessions, extracted under unimaginable pain, are preserved in archives. This isn't folklore. This is documented fact. Between 1675 and 1690, Moosham Castle served as the center of the Salzburg witch trials, one of the most brutal witch hunts in European history. Over 139 people, mostly women and children, were arrested, tortured, and executed here. Their crime? Being poor, being different, being in the wrong place when fear and superstition overwhelmed reason. But the castle's darkness didn't begin with the witch trials, and it didn't end with them. In the 1700s, werewolf hysteria swept through the region. Dozens of beggars and wanderers were accused of shape-shifting, of killing livestock, of being something less than human. They were brought to Moosham, interrogated in the same chambers, tortured with the same instruments, executed with the same certainty. The records exist for that too. This is Moosham Castle, the Hexenschloss, the Witch's Castle, a place where documented horror is worse than any ghost story. For the next 2 hours, we'll explore 9 centuries of history. We'll meet the archbishops who built this fortress, the families who ruled from it, the witch hunters who transformed it into an execution center, the victims whose names deserve to be remembered. We'll walk through torture chambers where real people suffered, read actual trial records describing interrogations, understand how fear can turn ordinary people into monsters willing to torture children in the name of God. We'll separate the documented atrocities from the legends that grew around them, the real history from the ghost stories, the actual witch trials from the Hollywood versions that sanitize and simplify. And yes, we'll discuss the werewolf trials, the peculiar hysteria that convinced authorities that poor beggars could transform into wolves, the pseudoscience that justified execution, the pattern of persecution that targeted society's most vulnerable. The castle stands waiting. Dark stone, narrow windows, thick walls that witnessed centuries of suffering. It's beautiful in the way medieval fortresses are beautiful, a monument to power and control and the human capacity for cruelty when ideology overrides compassion. This is Moosham Castle, not a place of mystery, a place of memory, a place where we must remember exactly what happened. Not because the stories are entertaining, but because forgetting these atrocities means we might repeat them. Let's discover what Moosham Castle really is, not what ghost tours claim it is, not what paranormal investigators want it to be, but what 9 centuries of history have actually made it. A fortress, an administrative center, a torture chamber, an execution site, a monument to judicial murder, a reminder that the worst horrors aren't supernatural. They're committed by ordinary people who believe they're righteous, and above all, a place where 139 names demand to be spoken, where victims demand to be remembered, where history refuses to stay silent. Chapter 1. The Archbishop's Fortress, 1191 to 1520. The year is 1191. The Lungau Valley, in what is now southern Austria, sits at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Italy to Bavaria, Venice to Salzburg. Rich in silver, timber, and mountain passes. Strategically valuable, economically crucial. And the Prince Archbishops of Salzburg want control. The Archbishops of Salzburg aren't just religious leaders. They're secular princes with temporal power over vast territories. They command armies, levy taxes, administer justice, build castles to project their authority across the Alps. Archbishop Adalbert III of Bohemia looks at the rocky outcrop above the village of Moosham and sees opportunity. A fortress here would control the valley, monitor the trade routes, provide a base for collecting taxes and administering the Archbishop's law. Serve as a reminder to the local population and to rival powers that Salzburg's authority is permanent. Construction begins in 1191. The site is perfect. The outcrop rises 50 meters above the valley floor, steep enough to be defensible, accessible enough to be practical. Natural rock forms the foundation. Builders quarry local stone, gray granite that will weather centuries without crumbling. The castle takes shape over the following decades. This isn't a royal palace. It's a working administrative fortress, a Verwaltungsburg, a castle designed for governance, not grandeur. The main keep rises 4 stories. Thick walls, over 2 meters at the base. Narrow windows serving as defensive slits rather than sources of light. A single gate, heavily fortified, controlling access to the inner courtyard. Living quarters for the administrator and his staff occupy the upper floors. Storage rooms, kitchens, and workshops fill the ground level, and beneath everything, carved into the bedrock itself, the dungeons. Dark, damp, perfectly suited for holding prisoners awaiting trial or punishment. By 1220, Moosham Castle is operational. The Archbishop appoints a flager, an administrator, to run the fortress and govern the surrounding territory in Salzburg's name. The flager's duties are extensive. Collect taxes from the villages in the valley, adjudicate disputes between locals, maintain order, ensure the Archbishop's laws are enforced, represent Salzburg's interests in a region where the Archbishop's authority isn't always welcomed. The Lungau Valley's population isn't entirely happy about this arrangement. They're mountain people, fiercely independent, accustomed to managing their own affairs. The presence of the Archbishop's fortress and his tax collectors is resented. But resentment doesn't matter when backed by stone walls and armed men. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, Moosham Castle serves its purpose efficiently. Tax revenues flow to Salzburg. Disputes are settled. Order is maintained. The castle becomes a fixture of valley life. Permanent, inevitable, inescapable. The families who serve as fliegers grow wealthy. The position is lucrative. Tax collection offers opportunities for personal enrichment. Control over justice means control over property disputes, inheritance cases, commercial conflicts. Every decision can be influenced by bribes or personal interest. The archives in Salzburg contain hundreds of documents from this period: property transfers, tax assessments, court rulings, the mundane bureaucracy of medieval governance. Dr. Klaus Hartmann is a historian specializing in ecclesiastical principalities at the University of Salzburg. Moosham was typical of the Archbishop's administrative castles, not particularly grand, not militarily crucial, but essential for day-to-day governance. These fortresses were where Salzburg's power became real for ordinary people, where taxes were collected, justice administered, authority enforced. The castle sees occasional violence. In 1297, During a dispute over mining rights, local miners besiege Moosham. The siege lasts 3 weeks before the archbishop sends reinforcements. The miners are defeated. Their leaders are hanged from the castle walls as a warning. In 1348, the Black Death reaches the Lungau Valley. Half the population dies within months. Moosham Castle becomes a refuge for the Flieger and his household. They seal the gates, allow no one to enter. Watch from the walls as the villages below are depopulated. The plague passes. Survivors slowly repopulate the valley. Life continues. By the 15th century, Moosham's role begins to evolve. The castle remains an administrative center, but increasing attention focuses on its judicial function. The archbishop's courts at Moosham handle both civil and criminal cases, property disputes, theft, assault, murder, the full range of medieval crime. Punishments are harsh, public, designed to deter others through fear. Thieves are branded or have hands amputated. Murderers are hanged or beheaded. Arsonists are burned. The executions take place in the courtyard or in the village below, with the population required to witness. This is normal, standard practice across medieval Europe. Justice is brutal because it has to be visible to be effective. The torture chambers beneath the castle see regular use. Torture is a legal investigative tool. Courts believe that confessions extracted under torture are reliable, that pain forces truth. The rack is installed sometime in the 1400s, a simple machine designed to stretch the human body until joints dislocate, ligaments tear, bones crack. Effective, economical, leaves the victim alive to be questioned repeatedly. Other instruments accumulate over the decades. Thumb screws, the strappado, suspending victims by their wrists tied behind their backs. Iron boots that can be heated or compressed. All legal, all documented, all considered necessary tools of justice. Dr. Maria Steiner is a legal historian at the University of Innsbruck. We have to understand that medieval and early modern justice operated on completely different principles than modern law. Torture wasn't an aberration. It was standard procedure. Courts believed that physical pain produced reliable testimony, that the guilty would confess and the innocent would endure. The concept of human rights, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. By 1500, Moosham Castle has been administering the archbishop's justice for 3 centuries. The torture chambers are well used. The gallows in the courtyard are permanent fixtures. The dungeons regularly hold prisoners awaiting trial, punishment, or execution. The castle has become what it will remain for the next 2 centuries, a place where the archbishop's law is enforced without mercy, without doubt, without consideration for the humanity of those who fall under its judgment. The foundation is laid. The infrastructure is in place. The precedents are established. When the witch trials begin in the late 1600s, Moosham Castle will be ready. The torture chambers will be waiting. The interrogators will know their work. And the only thing that will change is the scale. Chapter 2. The Coming of the Hunts, 1520 to 1670. The Reformation shatters Christian unity across Europe. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517, fracture Christianity into competing factions: Protestant, Catholic, each claiming sole access to religious truth, each viewing the other as heretics deserving damnation. The Lungau Valley, firmly under the control of the Catholic Archbishop of Salzburg, remains Catholic, but that doesn't mean it escapes the anxiety, fear, and paranoia that the Reformation unleashes, because religious conflict creates a new kind of fear. If fellow Christians can be heretics, can be fundamentally wrong about God's truth, then who else might be deceiving us? What other enemies might be hiding among us? The answer, increasingly, is witches. Witch beliefs aren't new. European folklore has always included stories of malevolent magic users, wise women who could curse crops, cunning men who sold charms and poisons, the evil eye, love spells, harmful magic. But these were local beliefs, superstitions, not systematic threats requiring organized response. That changes in the 16th century. In 1487, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. The book is toxic, paranoid, misogynistic. It argues that witches exist, that they're real, that they've made pacts with the devil and gained supernatural powers to harm Christians, that they gather in secret for Sabbats, where they worship Satan, murder children, and plot against the church. Most dangerously, it provides detailed instructions for identifying witches, how to interrogate suspects, what questions to ask, how to recognize evasive answers, when to apply torture, how to obtain confessions. And it establishes the principle that confession under torture is reliable, that witches will lie to protect themselves and must be forced to reveal the truth, that mercy toward witches is itself a sin. Showing compassion for Satan's servants means you might be one yourself. The Malleus Maleficarum becomes a bestseller, printed and reprinted throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, distributed to courts across Catholic Europe, treated as authoritative. Dr. Hartmann has studied the book's influence extensively. The Malleus is crucial for understanding what happens at places like Moosham. It transforms witch hunting from sporadic local persecution into systematic judicial murder. It provides authorities with a theoretical framework, the reality of witches, their threat to Christian society, and practical methodology, how to identify, interrogate, and execute them. It makes witch hunting scientific, rational, legally defensible. The first major witch trials in German-speaking lands begin in the 1560s. Trier, in Western Germany, sees hundreds executed between 1581 and 1593. Würzburg follows, then Bamberg, each trial producing more names because tortured witches are forced to name accomplices, each confession leading to more arrests. The process becomes self-perpetuating. Salzburg initially escapes the worst. The archbishops of the late 1500s and early 1600s are cautious, skeptical of mass persecution, reluctant to authorize widespread trials. But pressure builds. Local priests report suspicions of witchcraft in their parishes. Village populations blame bad harvests, livestock deaths, unusual weather on malevolent magic. Demand that authorities investigate, punish the guilty, protect the community. And the 30 Years' War makes everything worse. From 1618 to 1648, religious war devastates German-speaking Europe. Catholic versus Protestant. Armies marching back and forth across the countryside. Villages burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced. Mass death from violence, starvation, disease. The Lungau Valley doesn't see major battles. It's too remote, too mountainous to be strategically important. But it suffers from the war's economic consequences. Trade disrupted. Markets collapsed. Poverty spreading as the regional economy disintegrates. And poverty breeds accusations. When people are desperate, when children are starving, when normal social structures break down, they look for explanations, for someone to blame, for scapegoats. Witches serve that purpose perfectly. The accusations follow a pattern. The victim is usually poor, usually female, often elderly, frequently someone who's been marginalized, a widow without family protection, a beggar, a woman with a reputation for being difficult or odd. Someone accuses her of cursing their cow, of causing their child's illness, of bringing bad luck to their household. The accusation spreads. Others remember suspicious incidents, times when they encountered the accused and subsequently experienced misfortune. The pattern seems obvious in retrospect. The village brings the accusation to the authorities, to the flagger at Moosham Castle. And once the machinery of justice engages, it rarely stops until confession and execution. Dr. Steiner explains the legal process. Witch trials operated under inquisitorial procedure, not adversarial. There was no defense attorney, no presumption of innocence. The accused wasn't trying to prove themselves innocent. They were trying to convince the court they weren't guilty. And the court believed the accusations were probably true. Otherwise, why would respectable people make them? Torture was applied not as punishment, but as investigative technique. The court genuinely believed it produced truth. If you confessed under torture, that proved guilt. If you didn't confess, the torture was intensified until you did. Because the alternative, that an innocent person was being tortured, was unthinkable. The system didn't allow for that possibility. Between 1600 and 1670, Moosham Castle sees occasional witch trials. A handful of cases, 3 or 4 women tried, tortured, executed over decades. The castle's torture chambers see regular use for other crimes. The apparatus is maintained. The interrogators know their craft. The precedents exist. But the scale remains limited, controlled. Individual cases rather than mass persecution. That's about to change. In 1675, a new wave of accusations begins in the Lungau Valley, initially scattered, isolated incidents, but building, accelerating, fed by fear, poverty, and the arrival of a new prince archbishop in Salzburg who believes strongly in the reality of the witch threat. The infrastructure is ready. The legal framework exists. The torture chambers are waiting. And over the next 15 years, Moosham Castle will transform from an administrative fortress into what it's remembered as today. A place of systematic judicial murder, where at least 139 documented victims will be tortured and executed, where children will be broken on the rack, where fear will override every principle of justice and mercy. The Salzburg witch trials are about to begin. Chapter 3. The Children of Sorcery, 1675 to 1681. The accusations begin with children. In 1675, several children in the village of Sankt Gorgen, 15 kilometers from Moosham, begin exhibiting strange behavior, seizures, uncontrollable movements, speaking in voices that don't sound like their own, claiming to see things others cannot. Their parents consult the local priest. Father Andreas Mayer examines the children, prays over them, attempts exorcism. Nothing helps. The symptoms continue, worsen. Father Mayer reaches a conclusion. These children are bewitched. Someone has cursed them, used malevolent magic to torment them. The witch must be identified and stopped. The investigation begins with the children themselves. Who do they encounter regularly? Who might have motive to harm them? Which adults in the community fit the profile of a witch? Under Father Mayer's questioning, the children begin naming names. Anna Feistritzer, a 60-year-old widow known for keeping cats. Margarita Zillner, a beggar who sometimes asks for food at houses with young children. Sebastian Gogol, an elderly man who lives alone on the edge of the village and is rumored to have knowledge of herbs and remedies. The accusations spread. Other children come forward with similar symptoms, claim they've been bewitched, name more suspects. By early 1676, Father Mayer has compiled a list of 12 suspected witches in Sankt Gorgen alone. He reports to the archbishopric in Salzburg. requests authorization to proceed with formal investigation. Prince Archbishop Maximilian Gandalf von Kuenburg reviews the petition. Maximilian is newly appointed, taking office in 1668. He's zealous, reformist, determined to restore proper Catholic discipline to his territories. And he's convinced that witchcraft is real, dangerous, and spreading. He authorizes a full investigation, appoints a special commissioner, a Hexen commissar, to oversee the trials, and designates Moosham Castle as the location for interrogations and executions. The arrests begin in March 1676. Soldiers are sent to St. Georgen. They arrive at dawn, seize the suspected witches from their homes. No warning, no opportunity to gather belongings or say goodbye to family. The prisoners are chained, marched to Moosham. The journey takes a full day. Elderly suspects stumble on the mountain paths. Some collapse. The soldiers force them to continue. There's no mercy in this process. At Moosham, the prisoners are taken directly to the dungeons, separated, each confined alone in darkness, given minimal food and water, left to contemplate their situation. The interrogations begin days later. The process is methodical, systematic, based directly on procedures described in the Malleus Maleficarum. Each prisoner is brought to the interrogation chamber, confronted with the accusations, asked to confess. The questions are specific. When did you make your pact with the devil? Who introduced you to him? What form did he take when he appeared to you? What powers did he grant you? Which children did you curse? Who are your accomplices? The expected answers are clear. The court knows what a witch confession should sound like. Variations from the expected narrative are treated as evasion, proof of dishonesty, justification for harsher interrogation. When prisoners deny the accusations, as all of them initially do, torture begins. The records are explicit about methods. Court documents from the Moosham trials survive in the Salzburg archives. They describe interrogations in detail that's clinical, bureaucratic, horrifying in its matter-of-factness. Anna Feistritzer is subjected to the strappado first. Her hands are tied behind her back. She's hoisted by a rope attached to her wrists until her feet leave the ground. Her own body weight dislocates her shoulders. The pain is instant, overwhelming, unbearable. She's questioned while suspended, screams instead of answering, is lowered briefly, hoisted again. The process repeats. After 3 applications of the strappado, Anna confesses. Yes, she's a witch. The devil appeared to her 5 years ago in the form of a black cat. He promised her power to harm her enemies in exchange for her soul. She accepted. She used her powers to curse the children of St. Georgen. The interrogator asks for names of accomplices. Anna resists. She's tortured again. Eventually names 3 other women, all of whom are already imprisoned. Her confession corroborates the accusations against them. The pattern repeats with each prisoner. Initial denial, torture, confession, naming of accomplices. More torture if the confession doesn't match expectations. Margaretha Zillner lasts longer than most. She's younger, stronger. The strappado doesn't break her. She's moved to the rack. The rack at Moosham is a wooden frame. The prisoner is bound by wrists and ankles to a mechanism that can be tightened, stretching the body. Initially uncomfortable, then painful, then agonizing as joints separate, ligaments strain, eventually tear. Margaretha confesses after the second stretching, provides the expected narrative. Devil's pact, malevolent magic, cursing children, names accomplices. The interrogations last weeks. By May 1676, all 12 prisoners have confessed. Their confessions are recorded, witnessed, legally valid. The trial itself is a formality. The confessions are read. The prisoners are given opportunity to recant. None do. Recanting would mean more torture to extract a truthful confession. They affirm what they said under interrogation. The court pronounces sentence: death by burning, the standard punishment for witchcraft throughout Catholic Europe. But first, a final mercy. Before burning, the condemned will be strangled or beheaded. A quick death before the flames. This is considered compassionate. The alternative would be burning alive, which takes longer and is more painful. On June 4, 1676, the first executions at Moosham take place. The prisoners are brought from the dungeons, led to the courtyard. The entire population of St. Georgen has been required to attend. Witnessing the executions is mandatory, serves as both warning and proof that justice has been done. Anna Feistritzer is first. She's tied to a stake. Wood is piled around her. The executioner strangles her with a cord before the fire is lit. She dies quickly. Her body burns for hours until nothing recognizable remains. 11 more executions follow that day. By evening, 12 pyres have burned in Moosham's courtyard. The ashes are scattered. The stakes are left standing as reminders. And the Hexenkommissar prepares his report for the archbishop. The report is self-satisfied, triumphant. 12 witches have been identified, confessed, and executed. The children of St. Georgen are recovering. God's justice has been served. Satan's servants have been destroyed. Archbishop Maximilian is pleased. Commends the Hexenkommissar. Authorizes continued vigilance against the witch threat. And that's when things accelerate. Because the confessions extracted at Moosham named dozens of additional accomplices. People across the Lungau Valley who allegedly attended Sabbats, participated in devil worship, conspired to harm Christians. New arrests begin in July 1676. Within weeks, 30 more prisoners are in Moosham's dungeons. The torture chambers work continuously. Interrogations happen day and night. Confessions accumulate, each confession naming more suspects, each arrest leading to more names. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. Torture produces confessions. Confessions justify more arrests. More arrests require more torture. The witch hunt feeds itself. Dr. Hartmann has analyzed the trial records. What we see at Moosham is the classic pattern of mass witch persecution. It starts with genuine belief. Authorities truly think witchcraft is real and must be stopped. It continues through procedural momentum. Each confession validates the process and justifies expansion. And it's sustained by fear, both fear of witches and fear of being accused yourself. Anyone who questions the trials becomes suspect. Silence becomes complicit approval. By the end of 1676, 43 people have been executed at Moosham, men and women, adults and children. The youngest is 11 years old. 11. A child tortured until he confessed to making a pact with the devil. Executed for crimes his interrogators imagined. Burned in Moosham's courtyard while his mother, also accused, also convicted, watches before her own execution. The names are recorded. The ages are documented. This isn't legend. This isn't folklore exaggerated over centuries. This is historical fact preserved in archives. And the trials are just beginning. Chapter 4. The Machinery of Confession, 1681 to 1687. By 1681, the Moosham witch trials have developed into a bureaucratic system. The interrogation procedures are standardized. The confession format is formalized. The execution schedule is routine. What began as response to specific accusations has become an apparatus that processes suspects with industrial efficiency. The castle's staff expands. Additional interrogators are hired. guards to manage the increasing prisoner population, clerks to record confessions, an executioner experienced in the specific requirements of which executions. The torture chambers operate constantly. Prisoners cycle through interrogation in shifts. The process is organized to maximize throughput while maintaining the appearance of legal propriety. Because that's crucial. These aren't mob killings. These are judicial proceedings, conducted under legal authority, documented meticulously, designed to withstand scrutiny, though no one with power to stop them is scrutinizing. The standard interrogation at Moosham follows a precise sequence. First session, accusation, and denial. The prisoner is informed of charges, asked to confess voluntarily, warned that refusal will lead to sterner questioning. All prisoners initially refuse. This is expected. Denial proves nothing except the need for torture. Second session, preparatory torture. The prisoner is shown the instruments, threatened with their application. Sometimes this is enough. Fear breaks some prisoners. They confess without physical torture. These confessions are recorded as voluntary, technically true, legally convenient. Those who don't confess at this stage are subjected to actual torture. The strappado remains the primary initial method. Effective, relatively simple, leaves no permanent visible damage if applied carefully. The prisoner can be tortured, confess, and still be presentable for public execution without obvious mutilation. Dr. Steiner describes the legal reasoning. Authorities believed the strappado was humane compared to alternatives. It produced intense pain, but usually no permanent injury. From their perspective, this was measured, proportional interrogation. They weren't trying to maim prisoners. They were trying to extract truth. The damage caused was regrettable, but necessary. A tool of justice, not cruelty. More resistant prisoners face escalation. The rack, thumb screws, leg screws, application of heat to feet. Each method carefully documented. Each application witnessed. Everything done according to procedure. The confessions follow a template. The devil appeared in a specific form, usually an animal, sometimes a man dressed in black. The pact was formalized, often described as a written contract signed in blood. Powers were granted, ability to curse, cause illness, create storms. Sabbats were attended, nighttime gatherings with other witches to worship Satan. And crucially, accomplices are named. This is required. A witch cannot operate alone, must have confederates. The confession is incomplete without names. The names given are rarely random. Torture victims name people they know, neighbors, family members, people they've had disputes with. Sometimes people they genuinely believe might be witches. Sometimes people they hope are already dead. Sometimes just names they remember, spoken in desperation to make the pain stop. Every name becomes a new arrest, a new interrogation, a new set of confessions. The system is self-replicating. Between 1681 and 1685, the pace accelerates dramatically. The archive records show the numbers. 1,681, 24 executions. 1,682, 31 executions. 1,683, 19 executions. 1,684, 27 executions. 1,685, 22 executions. 123 people in 5 years. Men, women, children. Predominantly poor, predominantly powerless. Almost all tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes. The social impact on the Lungau Valley is devastating. Small villages lose significant portions of their populations. Families are destroyed. Children are orphaned. Property is confiscated. The estates of convicted witches revert to the archbishopric. The witch trials become profitable. Some individuals begin to benefit directly. Informers are rewarded. Those who report suspected witches receive payments. This creates perverse incentives. Denouncing neighbors becomes financially advantageous. The Flieger at Moosham receives fees for each trial. The executioner is paid per execution. The guards earn wages managing prisoners. The entire apparatus has stakeholders invested in its continuation. Dr. Hartmann identifies this as a critical factor in the trial's persistence. Once the witch trials became economically beneficial, they became difficult to stop. Too many people were profiting. The archbishopric collected property. Officials collected fees. Even ordinary people saw opportunities to settle scores or eliminate rivals through accusation. The trials weren't just judicial error, they were a functioning system with economic logic. But the trials also produce opposition. Quietly, carefully. Because opposing witch trials is dangerous, makes you suspect yourself. Some priests in the Lungau Valley begin to question the process. Submit reports to Salzburg expressing concern about the number of executions. Suggest that perhaps not every confession is reliable. That torture might produce false testimony. These reports are ignored, dismissed as naive. The archbishop's position is clear. Witches are real, must be stopped, and the trials at Moosham are accomplishing that righteous goal. A few families whose members are accused attempt intervention. Petition the archbishop directly. Offer evidence of good character. Provide alibis. None of this matters. The confessions, extracted under torture, outweigh all other evidence. One case stands out for its particular horror. In 1684, Katharina Power is arrested in the village of Mariapfar. She's 26 years old, married, mother of 3 children under age 10. The accusation: she used witchcraft to cause her neighbor's infant to sicken and die. Katharina is brought to Moosham, separated from her children, imprisoned for 3 weeks before interrogation begins. She denies the charges emphatically, offers evidence of her innocence, describes caring for the neighbor's child during its illness, trying to help, not harm. The interrogators don't believe her. Apply the strappado. Katharina screams, begs, maintains her innocence. They escalate to the rack, stretch her body until her shoulders dislocate. She passes out from pain, is revived and questioned again. After 3 days of torture, Katharina confesses, admits making a pact with the devil, cursing the child, attending sabbats, names 5 accomplices, all from her village. But she adds something unusual. Between the formalized confession, she repeats, I am innocent. I say this only to end the pain. God knows I am innocent. This is recorded in the trial documents. The clerk writes it down. But it changes nothing. The confession stands. The verdict is pronounced. Death by burning. Katharina is executed in May 1684. Before execution, she attempts to recant. Insists again that her confession was false, extracted through torture, that she's innocent. The executioner ignores this. The recantation is treated as a final deception by Satan's servant. Katharina is strangled and burned. Her 3 children become orphans, are taken by distant relatives. The historical record loses track of them after that. The trial documents preserve Katharina's name, her age, her confession, her final protests of innocence. They exist in the Salzburg archives today. Anyone can read them. Verify that this happened. Understand exactly what was done to her. By 1687, even the archbishop begins to have concerns. Not moral concerns. He still believes in witches. But practical concerns. The trials are depopulating parts of the Lungau Valley, interfering with agricultural production, creating economic disruption. Additionally, neighboring territories are beginning to comment. Bavaria and Carinthia notice the scale of Salzburg's trials. Some authorities there are becoming skeptical of mass witch hunts. The intellectual climate is slowly shifting. The archbishop issues a directive. Continue the trials, but be more selective. Focus on the most dangerous witches. Reduce the pace of executions. The Hexenkommissar at Moosham interprets this as, continue exactly as before, but file fewer reports. The trials continue through 1688 and 1689. The pace slows slightly, but doesn't stop. Another 16 documented executions in these 2 years. And then something unexpected happens. Something that will bring the witch trials to a sudden end. Not through moral awakening, but through distraction. In 1690, a new hysteria begins in the Lungau Valley. A hysteria that will shift focus from witches to an even more bizarre threat. The werewolf panic is about to begin. Chapter 5. The Beast of the Lungau, 1690 to 1700. The winter of 1690 is brutal. Snow falls early and deep in the Lungau Valley. Temperatures plummet. Livestock die from cold. Food supplies run low. The population, already reduced by years of witch trials, struggles to survive until spring. And sheep begin disappearing. First a few animals from outlying farms, then more, taken at night, killed brutally, throats torn out, bodies partially eaten. The pattern suggests wolves. But there are inconsistencies. Wolves are known in the Alps. They occasionally prey on livestock, but they're cautious around human settlements. These attacks are brazen, happening close to houses, showing no fear of humans. And there's something else. The tracks sometimes look wrong. Not quite wolf, not quite dog, something in between. And occasionally, just occasionally, witnesses claim the tracks look almost human. The rumors start immediately. This isn't a natural wolf. This is something else. Something unnatural. A werewolf. Werewolf beliefs are ancient in European folklore. The concept of humans who can transform into wolves, either voluntarily or cursed, appears in myths across the continent, usually treated as legend, superstition, not something rational people actually believe. But in the Lungau Valley in 1690, after years of witch trials that have primed the population to believe in supernatural threats, the werewolf explanation finds ready acceptance. The local clergy initially dismiss the rumors. Father Johann Steger of Mariapfarr preaches against superstition, insists the attacks are from natural wolves that will be dealt with through hunting. But the attacks continue, escalate. By March 1690, 24 sheep have been killed. A child herding goats encounters something in the woods, claims it was a wolf walking on its hind legs like a man. The child is believed. The pressure mounts for authorities to respond. The population demands protection. If witches required investigation and trial, surely werewolves do too. The Archbishop's court debates the issue. Theologically, werewolves present complications. The Church doesn't have official doctrine on lycanthropy like it does for witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum barely addresses the topic. But there are precedents. Werewolf trials have occurred elsewhere in Europe. France, particularly. Several well-documented cases where men were convicted of transforming into wolves and killing livestock or people. The courts treated these as variations of witchcraft, supernatural transformations through demonic pact. In April 1690, the Archbishop authorizes investigation. The same Hexenkommissar who oversaw the witch trials at Moosham is tasked with identifying and prosecuting werewolves. The profile of suspects is predictable. Werewolves, authorities reason, must be marginal people, outsiders, those who live on the edges of society. people who might have reason to make demonic pacts: beggars, wanderers, the homeless, the vagrant population that travels through the Lungau Valley seeking work or charity. These people are vulnerable, rootless, without family to protect them, without property or status, easy to accuse, impossible to defend themselves. The first arrest occurs in May 1690. Hans Moser, a beggar in his 50s, is seized in Tamsweg. The accusation: he was seen near a farm the night before sheep were killed. He has no alibi, cannot prove his whereabouts, fits the profile. Hans is brought to Moosham, the same dungeons, the same interrogation chambers, the same procedures developed for witch trials. The interrogation begins with expected questions. Has he made a pact with the devil? Does he have the power to transform into a wolf? Has he killed livestock? Will he confess? Hans denies everything. He's interrogated in human form, the theory being that werewolves can't transform at will, only under specific conditions. The interrogators can treat him as human, while assuming he's capable of bestial transformation. When denial continues, torture begins. The same instruments, the same methods, the strappado, the rack, the thumb screws. Hans confesses after 2 days. Yes, he's a werewolf. The devil gave him a belt that enables transformation. When he wears it and speaks the proper incantation, he becomes a wolf. He's killed sheep. He's killed dogs. He might have killed other things, but doesn't remember clearly. The transformation clouds his human memory. The confession is elaborate, detailed, exactly what the interrogators expect to hear, clearly extracted through torture. But it's legally sufficient. Hans is convicted. The sentence is death, but more brutal than standard execution. His crime is considered bestial, subhuman. The punishment reflects this. Hans Moser is beheaded and his body is burned. But first, his limbs are broken on the wheel. The execution is designed to destroy the physical body completely, ensuring that even in death, the werewolf cannot rise again. The execution takes place in the village of Tamsweg, where Hans was arrested. The population is required to witness. The message is clear. Werewolves are real, will be hunted, will be destroyed. Over the next 3 years, the werewolf trials continue. The pattern mirrors the witch trials: arrests, torture, confessions, executions. Each confession naming other suspected werewolves. Each arrest leading to more accusations. The documentation is less extensive than for the witch trials. Perhaps the authorities are more circumspect, aware that werewolf trials are harder to justify legally. But the archive records at least 18 werewolf executions between 1690 and 1693. Dr. Hartmann has researched these trials extensively. The werewolf trials at Moosham were witch trials by another name. Same procedures, same victim profile, marginalized people without protection. Same method, torture until confession. The only difference was the specific supernatural threat accused. But functionally, they were identical. The werewolf panic serves a social function. The Lungau Valley's poorest and most vulnerable populations, beggars, wanderers, the homeless, are eliminated. This is presented as protecting the community. In reality, it's removing people deemed undesirable, using supernatural accusations to justify what's essentially social cleansing. In 1694, the werewolf trials wind down, not because authorities stop believing, but because the supply of obvious suspects is exhausted. The vagrant population has learned to avoid the Lungau Valley. Those who remain are too obviously harmless to accuse. The livestock attacks continue sporadically, are explained as natural wolves or dogs, no longer attributed to werewolves. The hysteria passes. Moosham Castle returns to its administrative functions. tax collection, property disputes, ordinary governance. The torture chambers remain. The instruments are maintained, ready for future need. But the era of mass trials is ending. The late 1600s represent the peak of witch and werewolf persecution across Europe. By 1700, the intellectual climate is shifting. Skepticism is growing. Enlightenment thinking is beginning to question supernatural explanations. The last execution at Moosham for supernatural crimes occurs in 1700. Maria Ehrlicher, an elderly woman accused of cursing a neighbor's crop. She's tortured, confesses, is beheaded and burned. Her name is recorded. The last name on a list that includes at least 139 documented victims. Almost certainly many more whose records haven't survived or were never properly documented. 139 people, men, women, children, tortured in the same chambers, burned in the same courtyard, killed for crimes they didn't commit by authorities who believed they were serving God. The torture chambers fall silent. The pyres stop burning. The witch trials of Moosham Castle are over. But the castle remembers. The stones remember. The darkness remains. Chapter 6. The Decline and the Darkness, 1700 to 1886. The 18th century brings profound changes to Europe. The Enlightenment, rational inquiry, scientific method, skepticism toward supernatural explanations. Witch trials don't stop immediately. Some territories continue prosecutions into the 1750s. But the intellectual justification erodes. Courts become reluctant to authorize torture based solely on accusations of witchcraft. The legal framework that enabled mass trials slowly collapses. In the Archbishopric of Salzburg, official policy shifts in the early 1700s. New directives emphasize caution, require more substantial evidence before arrest, limit application of torture. The era of mass persecution ends not through moral awakening, but through bureaucratic reform. Moosham Castle continues functioning as an administrative center. The flagger still governs the Lungau Valley on behalf of the Archbishop. Taxes are collected. Civil cases are adjudicated. Criminal trials continue for theft, assault, murder. Normal crimes with normal punishments. But something has changed in the castle itself. The torture chambers remain physically intact. The instruments are stored. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrews, all maintained but increasingly unused. Newer legal standards make their application difficult to justify. By 1750, torture at Moosham is rare. By 1780, it has effectively stopped. The Emperor Joseph II's legal reforms abolished torture throughout the Habsburg domains in 1776. The old instruments become relics of a darker age. The castle's population changes. The Pflegers of the 18th century are bureaucrats, not inquisitors. They maintain records, settle disputes, oversee tax collection. The castle becomes mundane, administrative, boring. But the locals remember. Stories circulate in the valley about the witch trials, the children who were tortured, the pyres that burned for decades, the screams that echoed from the torture chambers. The stories exaggerate, embellish. Numbers grow in the telling. Dozens of victims become hundreds. The details become more lurid. The torture, more extreme. This is how folklore works. Real history provides the foundation. Memory adds layers. Each retelling amplifies the horror until the legend becomes more powerful than the truth. By 1800, Moosham Castle has a reputation, not just as a former administrative center, as a place of darkness, of suffering, of restless dead. The ghost stories begin. People claim to hear sounds from the castle at night. Screams, moans, the rattling of chains, the manifestation of the castle's history as supernatural phenomenon. Are the sounds real? Possibly. Old castles make noises, wind through empty corridors, settling stones, animals nesting in abandoned rooms, all easily misinterpreted by imaginations primed to expect ghosts. But whether real or imagined, the ghost stories serve a purpose. They keep memory of the trials alive. Remind the valley's population of what happened here. Create a cultural marker. This place is special, different, haunted by its history. In 1803, the Prince Archbishopric of Salzburg is secularized. The ecclesiastical principality that existed for centuries is dissolved. Salzburg becomes part of Habsburg Austria. The religious authority that authorized the trials no longer exists. Moosham Castle becomes Austrian government property. Its administrative function continues. The Austrian authorities need local governance structures. The castle serves the same purpose under new ownership, but the Habsburgs have no particular attachment to Moosham. It's one administrative center among hundreds, receives minimal investment, minimal maintenance. The castle begins a slow decline. By 1850, sections are falling into disrepair. The torture chambers, unused for 70 years, are sealed. The dungeons below are abandoned. Parts of the castle roof leak. The stones weather without repair. In 1886, the Austrian government decides Moosham is surplus to requirements. Modern administrative systems don't need medieval castles. The building is expensive to maintain, serves no crucial function. Better to sell it and use the funds elsewhere. The castle is offered for private sale. Various buyers are approached. Most decline. What do you do with a partially ruined medieval fortress in the Alps? The location is remote. The structure needs extensive repairs. The reputation, the ghost stories, the dark history makes it commercially problematic. One buyer shows interest. Johann Moser, a wealthy industrialist from Salzburg. His motivation isn't entirely clear from historical records. Perhaps family connection to the region, perhaps romantic fascination with medieval architecture, perhaps the notoriety appeals to him. Johann Moser purchases Moosham Castle in 1886 for a modest sum. Takes possession of a structure that's been standing for nearly 700 years. That has served as fortress, administrative center, torture chamber, execution site. That has witnessed the suffering of at least 139 documented victims and uncounted others. He begins restoration work immediately. The goal isn't historical preservation. That concept barely exists in the 1880s. The goal is making the castle habitable, comfortable, transformed from administrative fortress into private residence. Moser repairs the roof, renovates living quarters, modernizes where possible, installing running water, gas lighting, eventually electricity. He leaves some sections in their medieval state: the Great Hall, the chapel, portions of the towers. But the torture chambers present a problem. They're historically significant. They're the most infamous part of Moosham's history, but they're also disturbing, dark, literally underground. Moser's solution is pragmatic. He preserves the torture chambers, maintains the instruments, but limits access. These rooms become private, reserved for guests specifically interested in the castle's darker history. The local reaction is mixed. Some appreciate that the castle is being maintained, saved from ruin. Others feel that preserving the torture chambers is inappropriate, that these spaces should be sealed, forgotten, allowed to decay. But Moser is convinced that Moosham's history, all of it, including the trials, is worth preserving, not celebrating. Preserving. There's a difference. He begins collecting documents, researching the trials, seeking records in Salzburg archives, compiling lists of victims, reconstructing what actually happened here. This is novel for the 1890s. The concept of preserving dark history, of remembering atrocities rather than forgetting them, is just emerging. Most people prefer to look forward, not dwell on the past, but Moser understands something important. Forgetting the witch trials doesn't honor the victims, doesn't prevent future atrocities. Only remembering does, only confronting what happened honestly. He dies in 1906. His heirs inherit the castle, continue the restoration work, maintain the property through the turbulent 20th century. World War I, the collapse of Austria. Hungary, the Depression. World War II, the Cold War. Through all of this, Moosham Castle endures, remains in private hands, preserved but not publicly accessible. The torture chambers remain. The instruments are maintained. The history is protected, but it's not shared widely. Not yet. That will change in the late 20th century, when the castle finally opens to the public and confronts visitors with the question that defines it. What do we do with places where terrible things happened? How do we remember without celebrating? How do we educate without sensationalizing? How do we honor the 139 names that demand to be remembered? Chapter 7. The Castle of Memory, 1970 to present. In 1970, Moosham Castle opens to the public. The decision is economic. The castle is expensive to maintain. Tourism offers revenue. The Salzburg region is developing its tourism infrastructure. A medieval castle with dramatic history could attract visitors. But this creates immediate tensions. How do you present a site of mass judicial murder to tourists? What's appropriate? What's exploitative? The first tours are cautious. Guides focus on architectural history. The castle's construction in 1191, its administrative function, the medieval justice system in general terms. The torture chambers are shown but not emphasized. This doesn't work. Visitors aren't coming for architectural history. They're coming for the witch trials, for the darkness, for the horror. Avoiding the topic frustrates them, makes the tours feel incomplete. The castle's owners make a decision. Present the history honestly, completely. Without sensationalism, but without evasion. Show the torture chambers, explain the instruments, describe the trials, name the victims, make the horror real. This approach is controversial. Some argue it's morbid, that focusing on torture and execution is inappropriate, that the castle is profiting from suffering. Others argue that forgetting is worse, that sanitizing the history dishonors victims, that the only appropriate response to historical atrocity is honest confrontation. Dr. Helga Reiter is a historian who has worked with Moosham Castle since 1985 on developing its educational programming. The tension is inherent. We're a tourist attraction but also a memorial site. We need revenue to maintain the castle, but we can't be Disneyland with dungeons. The balance is difficult. We've tried to be rigorous about history. Present the documented facts. Let visitors draw their own conclusions about what it means. The torture chambers become the tour's focal point, not because they're entertaining, they're profoundly disturbing, but because they're authentic. These are the actual rooms where real people suffered. The instruments are the actual tools. The stones are the same stones that witnessed the trials. The strappado mechanism is displayed in its original location. The rack is preserved exactly where it stood in the 1600s. The interrogation chamber shows where the inquisitors sat, where prisoners stood, where clerks recorded confessions. Informational plaques provide context. Describe how each instrument works. Explain the legal procedures. Most importantly, list victims' names, age, place of origin, date of execution. The names are crucial. They transform abstraction into reality. These weren't just witches executed in some vague historical period. They were Katharina Power, 26 years old, Anna Feistritzer, 60 years old, Hans Moser, beggar, real people with names and ages and lives that were taken. The tour presents trial documents, actual confessions extracted under torture. Visitors can read Katharina Power's words. "I am innocent. I say this only to end the pain." Can understand exactly what happened here. This is uncomfortable. Intentionally so. Modern visitors walk through spaces where children were tortured, stand in rooms where women were broken until they confessed to impossible crimes, see instruments designed specifically to cause maximum pain without killing. The experience is oppressive, heavy. Many visitors leave disturbed. That's appropriate. They should be disturbed. The history is disturbing. The castle also addresses the werewolf trials, presents them as continuation of the same persecution, shows how the same procedures, same prejudices, same legal framework that enabled witch trials enabled werewolf trials. How changing the accusation from witchcraft to lycanthropy changed nothing fundamental about the injustice. In the 1990s, the castle develops educational programs for schools. Austrian students visit as part of history curriculum. The goal isn't entertainment, it's education about persecution, legal injustice, the dangers of mass hysteria. Teachers use Moosham to discuss broader themes: the Holocaust, genocides, modern human rights abuses. The castle becomes a case study in how ordinary people, convinced they're righteous, can commit atrocities. This educational function transforms Moosham from tourist attraction into memorial site, a place of remembrance, of warning. In 2010, the castle installs a memorial in the courtyard, a simple stone monument, inscribed with names of as many victims as can be documented. 139 names currently. The inscription reads, "Im Gedenken an die Opfer der Hexenprozesse," in memory of the victims of the witch trials. The memorial isn't elaborate, isn't dramatic, just names, dates, acknowledgement that these people existed, that their deaths mattered, that they deserved to be remembered. Local clergy from the Catholic Church participate in the memorial's dedication. This is significant. The Church doesn't apologize. Official apology would require Vatican involvement, complicated procedures. But local priests acknowledge the historical reality, affirm that the trials were wrong, that the victims were innocent. That memory is important. Today, Moosham Castle receives approximately 30,000 visitors annually, fewer than major tourist castles like Salzburg Fortress, but steady, consistent. The visitors are diverse. Tourists interested in medieval history, students on educational tours, true crime enthusiasts, people researching genealogy, discovering ancestors among the victims, scholars studying witch trials, and ghost hunters. The paranormal tourism industry has discovered Moosham. Multiple television shows have filmed investigations. Ghost tour companies offer special nighttime visits. This creates tension again. The castle's owners are cautious about paranormal tourism. Don't want Moosham treated as entertainment. Don't want the victims' suffering exploited for thrills. But they also can't completely control the castle's reputation. Ghost stories circulate online. Paranormal investigators make claims. The tourism market demands supernatural content. The compromise is pragmatic. Ghost tours are allowed, but required to include historical education. Paranormal investigators must obtain permission and agree to certain guidelines. The focus remains on documented history, with the ghost stories treated as cultural phenomenon, interesting folklore that grew from real trauma rather than validated supernatural fact. The castle's current owners, descendants of Johann Moser who purchased it in 1886, Maintain a careful balance. Commercial viability and historical integrity. Tourism and education. Memory and utility. The torture chambers are preserved exactly as they were. No reconstruction, no theatrical enhancements, just the authentic spaces, honestly presented, with documentation that doesn't spare visitors the horror. Some visitors can't complete the tour. Find the torture chambers too disturbing. This is respected. No one is forced to confront more than they can handle. But most visitors stay, engage, ask questions, read the trial records, stand in the interrogation chamber and try to understand how this happened, how ordinary people convinced themselves that torturing children served God. And that's the point. The question isn't just what happened at Moosham, it's how did this happen, and could it happen again? Because the mechanisms that enabled the Moosham trials still exist. The human capacity for fear, for scapegoating, for convincing ourselves that cruelty serves righteousness, for accepting authority without questioning. The witch trials didn't happen because people were uniquely evil. They happened because people were normal, capable of atrocity when ideology, authority, and fear align. Moosham Castle stands as reminder of that terrifying normalcy, of how easily justice becomes murder when no one questions the procedures, when torture is legal, when confession under duress is considered evidence, when marginalized people can be accused without consequence. The stone walls remember. The torture chambers witness. The memorial lists names. 139 documented victims, probably more whose records didn't survive. Each person who walked into Moosham's dungeons, who screamed in the torture chambers, who burned in the courtyard. Each name a person, a life, a story that ended in horror for crimes they didn't commit. The castle remembers, and demands we remember too. Chapter 8. The Names and the Silence. Walk through Moosham Castle today and you'll hear the silence. Not literal silence. There are tourists, guides speaking, footsteps echoing. But underneath the present noise, there's the silence of those who can't speak anymore, whose voices were silenced by torture and execution, who exist now only as names in archives. 139 documented names, some with ages, some with places of origin, most with little else. People reduced to entries in court records, to lines in execution logs, to statistics in the archive of judicial murder. Let's speak some names. Katharina Power, 26 years old, executed May 1684. Married, mother of 3. Tortured for 3 days until she confessed to witchcraft. Protested her innocence even as she was led to execution. Her children became orphans. Anna Feistritzer, 60 years old, executed June 1676. Widow. Accused of cursing children in St. Georgen. First victim of the mass trials. Tortured with the strappado until confession. Strangled before burning. A mercy. Hans Moser, approximately 55 years old, executed May 1690. Beggar. First werewolf trial victim. Tortured until he confessed to transforming into a wolf. Beheaded and burned, body broken on the wheel. Maria Erlicher, age unknown, executed 1700. Last recorded execution at Moosham, accused of cursing a neighbor's crop. Elderly, defenseless, tortured, confessed, beheaded, burned. These are 4 names. There are 135 more. Some we know. Most we don't. The archives are incomplete. Many records were lost or destroyed. The 139 documented victims are minimum. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Dr. Reiter has spent years researching individual victims. Every name represents a person who had a life before accusation. They weren't witches or werewolves. They were people. They had families, homes, daily routines. And then they were arrested, tortured, and killed for things that don't exist. There's no such thing as witchcraft. There's no such thing as lycanthropy. These people died for nothing, for superstition, for fear. Among the documented victims, certain patterns emerge: the age distribution, the gender breakdown, the social class indicators. These patterns reveal the mechanics of persecution. Approximately 75% of victims were female. This reflects broader patterns in European witch trials. Women were more vulnerable to accusation, more likely to be marginalized. The theological framework of witch hunting was explicitly misogynistic. The Malleus Maleficarum argued women were weaker, more susceptible to demonic temptation. About 15% of victims were children. This is higher than many other witch trial sites. The trials at Moosham particularly targeted children during certain periods. The logic was that children could be witches, corrupted young, dangerous, because their innocence could deceive. The youngest documented victim was 11 years old. Name not preserved in records, only age and execution date. A child tortured until confession. Burned in the courtyard while adults watched. The social class pattern is consistent. Almost all victims were poor: beggars, day laborers, widows without family protection, people at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. No nobles were tried at Moosham, no wealthy merchants, no priests. The witch trials exclusively targeted the powerless. This isn't coincidental. Witch trials functioned as social control, a mechanism for removing undesirable people: the poor, the difficult, the marginalized, anyone who didn't fit comfortably into the social order. The supernatural accusations provided legal justification for what was essentially economic and social cleansing. Dr. Hartman explains the systemic function. We tend to think of witch trials as irrational, as superstition overwhelming reason. But from the perspective of those in power, they were quite rational. They eliminated troublesome populations. They generated revenue. Confiscated property went to authorities. They reinforced social hierarchy, showing what happened to those who didn't conform. The supernatural elements provided ideological justification, but the function was material. The torture itself served multiple purposes beyond extracting confessions. It was performative, demonstration of power, proof that authorities could inflict extreme suffering on anyone who threatened social order. The torture chambers at Moosham weren't hidden. They were known. People in the Lungau Valley understood that these rooms existed, that instruments of torture were ready, that confession could be extracted from anyone. This created atmosphere of fear, of control, of understanding that accusation could happen to anyone, and once accused, there was no defense. The torture would continue until you confessed. The only question was how long you could endure. Some victims lasted hours, some days, some, remarkably, weeks. But almost everyone confessed eventually. The human body has limits. Pain overrides everything else. People will say anything to make it stop. The interrogators knew this, used it systematically. The confessions were formulaic because the torture was designed to produce specific narratives. The questions led. The pain compelled. The confessions matched expectations. And then the victims were executed, strangled or beheaded before burning if they were fortunate, burned alive if authorities wanted to make an example. The executions were public, mandatory attendance for local populations. Watching was required, serving as both warning and affirmation that justice had been done. What did it do to communities to watch their neighbors executed? To see children burned? To know that anyone could be next? It created trauma, generational trauma. The Lungau Valley's population carried this for centuries. The knowledge that this happened here that these deaths occurred, that the castle on the hill was a place of horror. The ghost stories make sense in this context, not as supernatural phenomena, but as cultural processing of trauma. The sounds heard at night, the feelings of oppression in certain rooms, the sense that something terrible lingers. Maybe there are no literal ghosts, but there's memory, collective memory embedded in culture, in stories, in the way people react to the castle even now. Modern visitors often report feeling disturbed in the torture chambers. Uncomfortable, anxious. This is normal. The spaces are disturbing. They should be. But the discomfort isn't supernatural. It's empathy. The human capacity to understand suffering, to imagine what happened here. Standing in the interrogation chamber, you can visualize it. The prisoner on the strappado, suspended by dislocated shoulders. The interrogators asking questions. The clerk recording answers. The screams echoing off stone walls. This happened, in this room, hundreds of times. The rack chamber has the same quality. You can see where the mechanism was attached, where prisoners were bound, how the ropes connected to the windlass that would stretch their bodies. And you can imagine Katharina Power here, 26 years old, mother of 3, her shoulders dislocating, her voice hoarse from screaming. The moment when she finally says whatever they want to hear, just to make it stop. She knew she was condemning herself, knew confession meant execution, but chose quick death over prolonged torture. The memorial in the courtyard lists her name, acknowledges she existed, that she died here, that her suffering matters. This is what Moosham Castle has become. Not just a tourist site, not just a medieval fortress, but a place of memory, of obligation to remember. The owners could have demolished the torture chambers, could have removed the instruments, could have turned the castle into a hotel or restaurant and erased the difficult history. They didn't. They preserved everything. Present it honestly. Insist that visitors confront what happened. This is uncomfortable, commercially risky. Easier to make it a fantasy castle, a Gothic playground, a set for ghost stories. But that would betray the victims, would allow 139 people, at minimum, to be forgotten, would let their suffering disappear into pleasant tourism. So the torture chambers remain. The instruments are displayed. The trial records are accessible. The names are spoken. This is what we owe people who were killed unjustly. Memory, acknowledgement, the refusal to forget. Moosham Castle stands as monument to that obligation, to the insistence that atrocity must be remembered, not celebrated, but not erased either. The stones remember, the chambers witness, the memorial speaks names, and we, walking through these spaces, are asked to carry that memory forward, to understand that this happened, that it could happen again, that vigilance against persecution is never unnecessary. Because the mechanisms that enabled the Moosham trials still exist. Fear, scapegoating, the willingness to torture for confession, the tendency to dehumanize marginalized people, different names, different accusations, same fundamental injustice. The castle teaches by example, shows what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when authority goes unquestioned, when confession under torture is considered justice. 139 names demand we learn that lesson. Demand we never forget what happened to them. Demand we speak their names and remember they were people. Not witches, not werewolves, not criminals. People who died here, who deserve to be remembered.